Good afternoon. My name is
Hi.
Clinton. I am an intern with the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 8th webinar in the Commission's 9-part webinar series, Growing Our Griots, Strengthening North Carolina's Black Heritage Keepers. During this series, we will explore how our state's Black heritage institutions can execute innovative and sustainable work with the insights of a diversity of culture workers from across the state and country, like today's guest, who I will introduce shortly. The North Carolina African American Heritage Commission received the American Rescue Plan Humanities Project Support Grant from the North Carolina Humanities Council to execute this series. You can learn more about the North Carolina Humanities Council online at www.nchumanities.org. Funding for ARP has been provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of the American Rescue Plan Act. Today, please drop all your questions in the chat where it will be monitored, and we'll be answering questions at the end. And I want to thank the members of the team who made today possible: Angela Thorpe, Director of the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission, Adrienne Nearday, Associate Director, and a special hello to John Cooper, Bia Pearson, Catalina Lopez, and Winifred Queer, grad students and undergrad students at UNC Greensboro, Wake Forest University, Belmont IB College, and Winston-Salem State University, respectively, who are joining us due to this funding. Today's webinar will be available via recording, and all participants will receive the link. And as a note, the final webinar in this series will take place on Tuesday, August 9th at 1 p.m. We'll be having a conversation with North Carolina heritage practitioners on their experiences in the field. In the meantime, I am thrilled to welcome our presenter for today, Witnie Martinez, nonprofit consultant and chief development officer at Project Science. Her full bio is available online via the Commission's website.
Thank you so much, Miranda, for not reading the full bio. You'll just read the first 2 sentences. So good to be here with you all today. So there's always a stigma with having a group that's too large or a group that's too small. I'm an introvert, so I like a small group. This is perfect. I was telling Miranda before you all logged on, I was like, yeah, maybe we'll have a very small group and it'll be like a private coaching session. So consider yourselves lucky today. So thank you so much again, Rosalind and Renee, for logging on. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get started. As beginners in the fundraising field, it's always difficult to wrap your mind around all of the things that go into creating a successful fundraising strategy, fundraising department. So I know you guys will have a lot of great questions to inform the presentation today. So looking forward to digging in. So Fundraising 101, I always say there are 3 main focus areas that can really help organizations maximize revenue. And so today we're going to focus on those 3 areas in particular. I can talk about fundraising probably for 12 hours straight. We're not going to do that today. We don't have the time to do that today, but I hope that you get some really helpful nuggets of information out of the presentation. So, all right. So we're going to go ahead and start with the objectives for today. Our focus is going to be on 3 components that create a very successful fundraising strategy. And a successful fundraising strategy will eventually lead to an increase in revenue if executed appropriately. So we're going to focus on stewardship, caring for your current donors. We're going to focus on cultivation, bringing in new donors, and sustainability. Not just sustainability all on its own, but how stewardship and cultivation can tie into your strategy to lead to sustainability. So I want to start with the very basics of the donor life cycle. What does that look like? Every profession has a life cycle for its customers, and for fundraising, this is ours, right? In a nutshell. You can Google this, you'll find different models with different steps between where the arrows are. This was the most sort of simplified, least complex version that I think will be helpful, especially if you're beginning in the field. So we start with identifying our donors, right? And there are many ways to do that. And we'll dig into that prospecting piece a little bit later on how to identify donors, where we can find donors from. Then we come to the qualifying stage. We've identified a donor, for example, Bank of America. We've identified them. We know they give money out. Fantastic. We know they're a donor. Now we have to qualify Bank of America and ask ourselves some questions. Does Bank of America support arts and culture? Does Bank of America support Black-led institutions or BIPOC institutions? Does Bank of America support heritage, the heritage and humanities sector? So there's a lot of questions to ask when you get into this space of qualify. And typically what I found is that many nonprofits don't really know the questions to ask in order to qualify the actual donor. They'll say, oh, Bank of America gives to education institutions. Let's find the person and write a grant and submit it. Or they don't even find the person, right? The contact at the institution. They just say, oh, their application link is open. It's public. Let's go ahead and apply. But that qualification stage will save you a lot of time and energy and eventually money if you really take the time to qualify your prospects. And we'll go through a list of questions later on, sort of like a rubric later on in this presentation that shows you how to qualify and the type of questions you can ask to qualify a potential donor prospect. The third step is to cultivate. So once you've qualified, here we're assuming that the prospect is actually a good fit to fund your organization. So now it's time to really cultivate them. We'll get into that piece pretty deeply as well, but cultivation in a nutshell is all the activities that you do to take this donor from being potential donor from being a prospect to securing them as an actual donor to your institution. So to make it easier to think about, it's everything that Target, right, as a corporation does to get a customer from coming into the door and looking on the shelves to actually making a purchase. The fourth stage, solicit. This is when we're asking. You can interchange this with the word ask. This is when we're asking for the dollars. We're asking for what we need or for what we want. This stage in green, you won't typically find in many of the models out there. I actually added this. I made this model because I wanted to add the close stage. A lot of fundraisers out there or development officers will say, well, I asked for the money. I solicited, I sent the letter, I sent the email, nobody's getting back to me. That solicitation doesn't mean too much until you actually close it, right? And bring in dollars into the organization to help fund these amazing missions that we have, that we need to fund. So after the close stage, we steward. You've gotten the money, right? You made them. And so there's a little bit of a in-between phases here too. So let me take a step back. So once you've asked for the dollars, let's assume the donor gives you the dollars, right? They mail it in, they pay online, whatever. What happens after you close? And this piece to me is kind of like the qualify piece, where we don't spend enough time as nonprofits really stewarding our donors between the time they actually give us the gift and between the time that the next gift is probably going to be due. So a couple of things I want to dispel about this cycle a little bit here. So you get to the solicit phase, I ask for the money, right? Donor says, yes, I'll give you $10,000. You have closed that gift. As soon as a donor says yes, you have technically closed that gift. But organizations document this differently in their database systems, right? You may have organizations that say, yeah, once they confirm, you've closed it. Fantastic. Other organizations say it's not closed until it hits our bank account. So that piece I feel like it varies across organizations, but it's so important to also come to terms as a team on the shared terminology and shared language for your particular organization as well, to make sure you all are on the same page. After you've received the money or you've closed those dollars, right, is the stewardship phase. And stewardship in a nutshell is what we're doing to keep the donor in the door. How are we keeping this customer in the door? How are we showing them appreciation beyond the database, just sending them, hey, thank you for your donation letter, or you just sending them, thank you for your donation letter. I personally identify stewardship as non-transactional touch points. So those touch points that don't have anything to do with the gift. I mean, we know we're stewarding them, right? Because they're a donor, but those touch points that don't say, oh, by the way, thank you for your $10,000, or the ones that don't say, oh, thank you for your membership, if you're a cultural institution with a membership program. The stewardship touch points are more like, hey, I just wanted to reach out to you because we have a program happening here next week and would love for you to be able to stop by. Or, hey, we have a virtual program, right? We're in the virtual age. We have a virtual program taking place. We would love for you to be a part of it. At its highest level, this stewardship piece turns into donor engagement in a way where the donor becomes an advocate for your organization. So there's, does somebody have I heard a little something there. Okay. Right, so you have your basic stewardship activities that can take place. Hey, the donor gave money. You know, you can send a handwritten note and say, oh my gosh, thank you so much for donating. We have an event next week, would love for you to come. That's still a little transactional, right? You're putting the dollar amount in there, but we know at some point throughout the year, we're going to have to thank this donor for the gift that they gave. But stewardship at its truest level really focuses on non-transactional touch points. It's the moment where you reach out to the donor and say, hey, I just wanted to say happy early birthday. I know your birthday's on Sunday, but I'm going to be out of town, but I didn't want to miss it. Or you are grocery shopping with your family, right? And you stop by the card section to get a happy anniversary card. I've done that one a few times. Oh, somebody's marriage anniversary is coming up. Let me just send them a quick card. And it's not the one where you have the whole organization sign it. It's personal because you actually care about the donor as a person and not just about the donor as a donor. And those touch points go a really long way. So we'll get into that a little bit. A lot of it into that a little bit in this presentation. A lot of lot of. So now digging in really deep here, again, we have limited time. I want to make sure that you all have the information that you need to be able to successfully run your development shop. So we have 3 key focus areas back to the stewardship, cultivation, and the sustainability piece. I will preface by saying that all of these areas I mentioned in this donor life cycle are critically important, right, for us to take our time on to build sustainability. But the 2 most overarching areas that you really want to focus on are stewardship and cultivation. Again, stewardship, I won't read through all of these bullets, but stewardship defined as those non-transactional touch points that you have. And then the cultivation piece and getting the caring for your current donors, and cultivation, that cultivation piece of, hey, how am I getting new donors into the door, right? So there are different methods that you can use to steward your donors. And one of the biggest areas within nonprofit organizations that hasn't been leveraged, and I think it's been leveraged now since with the whole pandemic and, you know, things shifting into a more digital world, is the marketing piece. And how does marketing really integrate with what you're doing from a development standpoint at your organization? And being able to segment your donors into different groups. If you have 100 donors and 50 of them are male, you know, 25 of them are female, another 25 are non-binary, or part, you know, how do you segment those donors so that you're providing them with materials and content that are, that make them feel like they belong as a part of your institution? So really taking the time to segment your donors so that you can appropriately steward them at a level that is personal to them. The next piece is educating your donors about the organization's mission. I have seen where nonprofits bring a donor into the door and they're jumping to step 5 before the donor even knows how many students you're serving, or how many exhibitions do you have in a year, or how many historians do you have coming to educate the community about Black art or collecting Black art, or about the history, right, of African Americans and art in this country, or heritage and humanities in this country. So it's been, it has to be a give and take sort of relationship with your donors. But as a nonprofit, it's our job to give first, right, before we can take. Because if we don't give, there will be nothing to take because the donors won't be giving anything, right, until they feel really connected to the mission. Hosting special gatherings. I mean, we've all been there, right, where we know nonprofits hold special events. But what we don't realize sometimes is that those events don't really yield enough of a ROI or return on investment that return on investment is so low. You know, you spend $25,000 on an event and you make $5,000, then you have to ask the hard question around, was it really worth it, right? So that's part of the stewardship process as well. Yes, we're going to steward our donors to the best of our capability, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we are doing things from a business perspective that also yield a high ROI for the organization. So we don't go out of business, right? We want to keep fulfilling our mission and serving our mission. Which leads to the last point, which is this idea of building excitement around the mission. It's not enough to just share a PowerPoint with your donors. It's not enough to just shoot out an email and say, here's what we do, here's how we do it. Could you donate $5,000 or $500? People want to feel connected. They want to feel like they belong. They want to feel like they're a part of the work that you are doing. And that's what stewardship does at its highest level. It makes people feel like they are a part of the work, to the point where they want to go out and advocate for your mission. Jumping over to the cultivation piece, cultivation is such a critical piece of nonprofit fundraising success, and many organizations don't focus enough time on it. And it's not because they don't want to. Part of it is maybe they don't have the knowledge really on how to create a really strong prospect pipeline or cultivation machine. Right? Funding is a part of that. There's not enough money to spend on creating this, right? This large strategy that's going to get us more donors in the door. We just kind of grab people as they come, or if somebody refers it, or if the board says, hey, reach out to this person, you know, we get sort of stuck in this reactive mode rather than being proactive, because thirdly, the last reason, there's money and time, right? Money, time, the lack of resources, whether that be financial or people resources, the time, it takes time to really build these strategies for successful fundraising. But what I do want to share is once you've built it, then you're maintaining, you're optimizing, right? You're shifting, you're moving things around, but you're not being reactive to the things that are coming into your circle and your purview day to day. You are really being proactive as opposed to reactive. You have a plan, and the purpose of having the plan for fundraising is not to say you are going to check off every single mark on that plan and complete it perfectly by the end of the year or 2 years or 3 years, but it's to say, hey, I have a plan, but now I need to be adaptable because a pandemic just hit. What do I need to shift? But now I need to be adaptable because half of my fundraising team just resigned. What do I need to shift? We have to be adaptable. You know, we're going through the great resignation. What are the things that I can shift, that I need to shift? What do I need support in? The plan helps you pivot more flexibly, is what the purpose of the plan is. Okay. And lastly, we get to sustainability. Part of sustainability, and one of the clearest parts of sustainability, is making sure that you're developing a very clear strategy for what sustainability looks like. And what is sustainability, right? Sustainability is the ability to see through to your long-term impact in a very consistent way. So some organizations focus on short-term sustainability, which is a bit of an oxymoron, but that's okay. Short-term for a multi-billion-dollar corporation might be 3 years. For a nonprofit, that almost feels like a lifetime, right? Because things change so much across the fundraising landscape and across the nonprofit landscape. And with the battle and the other, the battle of having enough resources to deal with those changes that are happening. But developing a very clear strategy, where I just spoke about that just a moment ago here. Securing multi-year investments from major and non-major donors. There's a stigma out there that, especially smaller nonprofits, that, hey, we don't have donors from multi-year funding. We don't have any donors that even give more than $1,000. So we can't focus on multi-year funding. But you can. Multi-year funding can be $50. It could be $25, $10, right? It could be $100, $5,000, $5 million. It just depends on your organization and what sustainability looks like for you. And if you want to compare your fundraising strategy or potential fundraising strategy to that of another organization, don't look at the organization that has, 25 million more dollars than you do, or has an exponentially lower fundraising bracket than you do, or even at equal, but try to look at organizations that are kind of where you're trying to be in alignment with that strategic plan. So if you're a $1 million organization, don't look at the 10 million, but maybe look at the 5, because 5 is where you want to get to over the course of the next 10 years. And look at that, call them, have a meeting with them, ask them how they got there. Maybe they'll be willing to share best practices within the sector, right? Next, focusing on the increase of national funding opportunities. I put that in there for, in the case that we had really large fundraising organizations on with us today. So, I could skip over it, but just in case. The national fundraising opportunities, the positivity that I've seen with those is, or the pitfall, I've seen with not having national funding, especially for the larger nonprofits who serve regionally, is that, if I'm serving in 5 states, let's say I'm serving in North Carolina, Florida, Virginia, New York, and Illinois, right? Then now I'm only focused on those states and getting funding from those states. But then something like the pandemic happens, and now school budgets are, dwindling down. So now my programmatic platform and impact isn't as wide as it used to be. So now what do I do? With national funding opportunities, if you are a large nonprofit or organization, you don't have to worry about the regional ramifications of that, right? The national funding opportunities will help you no matter where you're based, for the most part. I think I touched on these other 2 areas here as well. So let's get into the next slide. But before we even do that, I did want to say, with stewardship, cultivation, and ensuring sustainability, there are 3 areas that really have to be through lines across all 3 of these components. That's your team capacity, making sure as you are building out your fundraising strategy, right? We only have time to focus on fundraising today. We're not going into org-wide strategy just yet. But as you're focusing on the fundraising strategy, talk to your executive director and talk and collaborate across teams to figure out what the building of team capacity is going to look like, not just for your team, but across the organization. Because your ability to raise funds is going to be so dependent upon how clear of a strategy the organization has overall, which then feeds down to each department's strategy, including yours, right? And to be able to say with clarity how the organization is going to be growing, how we're going to be building team capacity. The other area of building team capacity that is super important to share with this group is ensuring that you're not the only person on your team who knows how to do everything, right? With smaller organizations, we all wear so many different hats. So it's so easy to fall into, okay, I do individual, corporate, and foundation, and I write the grants, and I do special events, and some small organizations don't even have a marketing team, we just can't afford it, right? So I'm also doing the donor newsletter, and I'm doing the e-blast, and going into MailChimp, checking out Eventbrite. We're doing so much that as we begin to build our teams, it's hard to let things go and pass these things on to others. But it's so important that we are sharing the capacity, of the team. Not everybody's going to know every single last thing across everybody's line of work or position, but there has to be some sort of balance. So if somebody is out, right, on a medical leave for a month, that we don't now need to go find, one, we're not left in the dark. And 2, we're not needing to go find an extra $25,000 to go pay a consultant when that $25K could have just went into our programs if we had some sort of team capacity built, right? There's going to be special instances, but that's the other piece of team capacity that I'm referring to. And then across everything you do, and you all know this, you have to leverage your data. You have to leverage your marketing, and you have to leverage technology. You can't do anything without data, right? So once you get into building your stewardship and cultivation plan and your strategy for sustainability, you have to have the historical data, if you're not a new organization, to understand the foundation of your donors, to understand the giving trends, to understand your donor retention rate and what that's looked like. Understanding where the department and where the data has been so you can understand better where you're going. And so you can help inform your decision-making as you're trying to build or rebuild your development department. Marketing, I touched on earlier, so critically important, such a critically important element of nonprofit fundraising. And again, for smaller organizations who may not have a marketing department where the development person is doing everything, there are many strategies that you can implement to make sure that you are not drowning, but still getting done at least the basics of what need to be done and still stewarding and cultivating your donors. Technology, of course, is another piece that has risen right up above the water so strongly over the last 2.5 years during this pandemic. We all have had to get adept, right? Look at the Zoom call with technologies to a certain extent over the last 2.5 years, whereas before it wasn't really a requirement, right? Teams are using, Google Workspace, and we're using Zoom, and we're using Teams, and we're using Asana, and we're using, ClickUp and Basecamp and all kinds of project management software. And the one thing that has held true is, most nonprofits are still using their database, right, to host the information about their donors. But now the piece that has emerged from that is nonprofit database, all of the other technological advances, is this integration piece. How can you make your work easier and not harder? How can we work smarter and not harder by making sure that you have a database, right, that fits within your budget, but is also capable of integrating with other technological advances to automate some of the functions that are happening across the organization, especially for small shops. So sometimes it's worth that extra investment to automate some of the work so that you're not too focused on getting it all done yourself, because as we all know, in nonprofit, it never gets all done, right? And then lastly, creating and institutionalizing systems and processes. And the best question I can think of for that is asking yourself, how do we do that here? And that's not saying, hey, new employee, this is how we do this here, you can never change it. But being able to share, right, as you're building team capacity with new team members, here is how we cultivate our donors here at our organization. Here is how we steward our donors. Here is the documented process for stewardship. Here are the clear questions that we ask about cultivation and prospecting when it comes to our donors. Without clarity, you can always add to it, edit, right? Shift some things, take some things out, add some things in, but you have to have something, and that something could just be a one-pager. It doesn't have to be a binder, right? Or a book full of information. Let's go on and go to the next slide here. And please do save your questions for the end. We will have some time for questions. So I touched on this a bit, and you all have access to this presentation. The stewardship piece is everything that we just talked about on the last slide. But what's super important is to be able to not only define what you're going to be doing under stewardship, right? Like such as these examples I have here. I tried to think of some of the most common examples that I've ran into with organizations in the past, but having the rationale for the why you're doing it. So if we're talking about, let's pick one here, build retention via non-transactional touch points. Let's just take the first one as an example. Why is that important? I mean, one could argue and say it's important because we want donors to renew. But think about the entire process, and we're going to go through that in just a moment here, right? So you can pick really any of these bullets, but look at that first bullet. Building a steady base of donors allows us to form deeper relationships and loyalty. So we want to build retention and through non-transactional touch points, because that will allow us to build a steady base of donors, which will allow us to form deeper relationships and build donor loyalty. And donor loyalty creates revenue sustainability. It allows you to work smarter and not harder, and makes your renewals more automated, right? And it, at the end, at its highest level, donor stewardship, as I mentioned before, creates a community of champions and advocates for your organization. So now you have free marketing walking around out there, right? And giving you money, right? And you don't have to pay for it. That's what you want. You want donor engagement at the highest level. Are all donors going to be that? Absolutely not, right? That'll never happen. But you want to, the earlier you can start, the better. Because donors who become champions and advocates of your organization are priceless. And they are also very contagious. Those are the donors you want coming to those special gatherings and experiences. You want those donors logging in online, because if you have an active chat session during a program or an event or a webinar, you want them chiming in and saying, oh, I'm so glad I support, this organization. If you want to make a donation, do this. Get them involved, right? Make them feel like they belong here. Make them feel like they're engaged and and that you care about their engagement at the highest level. So what does stewardship look like? What could that look like? Here's a sample schedule of interactions for stewardship that I created for an organization. And what I like to do is say, if we could ideally steward our donors in the most perfect way possible, what are all the steps we would do? This is what this is. Now, this particular organization decided, look, we can do number 1 through 4, and then we're going to pick 1 in phase 2, and we're going to pick 1 in phase 3. Okay, the phases are there to the left. You have the action item. Notice there are 16 steps here in the stewardship interaction schedule, but it's very clear what it is that needs to be done within this cycle, the audience that is going to be targeted, and the timeline by which it needs to happen. Now, again, we go back to this. Do we follow this to the T? I don't know any organization not small organizations, right? The capacity to be able to do that is just not there. But this gives you, again, just like the strategy comment I made earlier, it gives you a baseline to work from. So you might say, oh my gosh, I needed to get, the thank you calls done for my donors who gave $1,000 plus within 14 days of the gift. But, I'm going on vacation next week and that's their 14-day. What do I do? Is it the end of the world if you push it back a week? Probably not, right? Could you get it done before? But it gives you a barometer to work from. So your goals and the action items that you have in your head are not just floating out and about. And this is something that I've done this plan across multiple organizations and through consultancy. And I have gotten so much positive feedback just on numbers 1 through 4, because another piece of the bottleneck that kept organizations from saying completing something like number 7 or number 9 or number 10 is that step number 4 never happened. They would say, oh, wait a minute, but our database doesn't even integrate with MailChimp or doesn't integrate with Constant Contact, which most databases nowadays do. Or they would say, yeah, those donor emails never made it into our email database. Well, it's going to be kind of hard to steward your donors, especially in this digital age, if they're not, right, in steps 5 through 16, if that first simple step isn't done. And simple is relative, right? It takes work to make those things happen. So this is critically important. And you'll have a copy of this. You'll be able to maybe even devise your own type of version. The cultivation piece we talked about pretty deeply, but what I want to get into in the essence of time is make sure you have a database that is relevant to the level of where your organization is. I've been in organizations that have, 150, maybe 300 donors, but they have a database system that's meant for organizations that are $30 million organizations with 10,000 donors. One, you're spending money that you probably don't have, right? Use that money elsewhere. Use it, put it back towards the mission and towards the impact. Just get a database. Do not use Excel. get a database. And there are a couple of free ones out there, ones where you pay a small fee. TechSoup.com is a great resource for that, where you get a free administrator license for a database or different types of software. But get a database that can help you manage your donor information and communications, not just the gifts, but the interactions as well. Because what typically happens, look, nonprofit tends to be a pretty high turnover field, right? Especially when you get into development. But what you don't want to happen is that you build this donor base of 500 donors, you bring in a development person, they stay for a year and a half, they've met 200 of those donors, now you lose contact, right? And with the person who's transitioned, team member who's transitioned, but you don't know where the conversation ended. You might have some knowledge of some of the conversations, but there might be 100 out there that you're like, I'm not sure where this conversation ended. You don't have time to go back fielding through their emails. You want to make sure you have a database that can track that communication. Because what's important for the business is that we're staying on top of our customers, right? Or donors for long-term loyalty and sustainability. If that relationship keeps shifting, then there's another layer there that we have to care for. One of the other pieces that's been a primary priority for organizations is, how do we diversify our donor base? And this third bullet on the right here shares some of that. How do we diversify our donor base? Like, most of our donors are large corporations, are majority white. You know, how do we get Black donors or BIPOC donors in the door to help fund our mission so that our donors can be more representative of the populations that we're serving? And there are so many ways to do that. We're going to get into that cultivation sheet that'll give you an idea of over 25 different sectors that you can target for these types of diversifying and diversity initiatives as well. Two other ones that come to mind for me are always Black fraternities and sororities, Black ERG groups at the different corporations that are already funding you. They want their employees to be involved. So how can we get their employees involved? And which would, right, increase the ROI for you, potentially for a bigger gift year after year. So finding ways to connect those dots. I've been with organizations that focus on Black churches, right? So you may not be getting hundreds of thousands of dollars from these corporations or even thousands, but part of what makes African-American heritage institutions so special is this strong connection, right, to our heritage and to our history and to our community. Because we see ourselves as having a service to our community, to the Black community specifically. And churches have always historically been a deep part in that fabric of how we bring our community together as African Americans. So some ideas of some of the different sectors that you can reach out to. I did this for a past organization, and what we did was we went through and highlighted, 4 to 5, maybe 6 here, of the top sectors that we needed to reach out to, that we just did not have funding from. So yes, these are all the sectors, but we'll never be able to get to all of the sectors. One of the ways that I have found the most dollars for organizations that I've either worked for or consulted with has been by going to similar organization websites that list their donors and seeing who has funded them, and then looking those donors up. So I go to the organization, I find who the donor is, and then I do 2 things. One, I try to find out what the amount is. Not everybody lists the amount, right? I try to find out what the amount is. I'll go to the donors. If it's a foundation, I'll look up their 990 in GuideStar. And the 990 will tell you every organization that foundation has given to over the course of the last fiscal year, or in their case, if they're on calendar year, over their calendar year. And it'll tell you how much, and it'll tell you where the organization's located. So I find that to be a highly valuable resource for when I reach out to folks. Because if I go to a foundation and I'm like, okay, they've given to 100 organizations last year, this is great. All education organizations, this might be a great fit, but this is part of that qualifying phase, right? But then I go into their 990 and I'm like, okay, you gave 500 here, 1,000 there. I don't see anything here over $1,000. I likely won't even waste my time at that point. this will be a very low priority. But again, it depends on your strategy, right? I tend to fundraise on the major gifts fundraising side, 25,000 and up. So depending on the organization, some organization major gifts are 100K and up. So for me, that wouldn't be a good prospect. But if you're starting out in fundraising, right, and your goal is to take care of non-major gifts, that might be a good resource. That might be a good organization for you to reach out to. So that 990 gives you a lot of information in terms of who you could reach out to. So depending on your particular organization, make a list of potential donors. I always tell folks, look around your house. Household brands alone. Look behind your laundry detergent. Most of them are Procter & Gamble related. Look at your pens. Oh, Papermate. Look at your colored pens. Oh, Crayola. If you're in education, look around you at all these household brands. Look up their foundation or grant giving. Most of them have one. And start making your list of the top 20 to 25. And then go through that list and say, okay, you know what? We have a lot of pharmacies who give to us. So we don't even have to target this right now. But here are 5 that we haven't even thought about. Auto dealerships, for example, for STEM organizations, right? So I always say there is unlimited money out there, is what I always say, right? But it's our job as fundraisers and organizations to really go and find them. And then we get into this idea of cultivation, where I mentioned earlier, asking the right questions when it comes to cultivation. Making sure you're asking the right questions. This starting internally and going externally. So internally, you start with, what does the organization need, right? And then you go more externally. Okay, how do we make sure that there's an alignment here with this prospect? Does this prospect support DEIB? Does this prospect have a priority in their CSR, corporate and social responsibility, right? Priorities that align with our mission. You have to get that mission alignment before you move forward. If you don't, it's going to be a really hard road to go down. And then we get into this idea of building sustainability. Being able to secure multi-year gifts, that first bullet on the right, is one of the best ways to secure your organization's sustainability. It's a mindset change of saying, hey, can you renew your $100 this year, to here's what we're trying to do. We're trying to serve, at 500 students by the end of next year. This year we served 400. We want to increase it by 100 students. But what we really need is, transformational support. What we really need is a multi-year commitment. Or maybe you're going and saying, we're serving 500 students next year, in fiscal year 20 and fiscal year 23 and fiscal year 24, we want to serve 1,000. In fiscal year 25, we want to serve 2,000. And here is what it's going to take for us from a revenue building side. And we need 10 donors that will make a commitment of $1,000 for the next 3 years, each year for the next 3 years. Will you be one of those donors and join us in that fight? And stay quiet, right? And let them answer, right? And this is after, of course, you've talked to the donor, right? You've stewarded them. If they're a current donor, if they're a new donor, you've already given them information. You've invited them here and there. You've had personal conversations. You found out what their giving priorities are. Who else are they giving to? Where does education, or where does heritage and humanities and the arts and culture fall within their giving priorities before you can make the ask and really structure the ask? And we talked about creating a staff structure as well a little bit earlier on. And our national funding sources also pop up here. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. I want to leave the last 10 minutes. Let's do the last 8 minutes or so for questions. So let me talk here for just another 90 seconds or so. So when you're thinking about your fundraising strategy, it's so important to think about how you're going to grow. At its most simple level, you can say, hey, we're $1 million organization this year. This year, we want to get to 1.2. Okay, well, why did you pick 1.2, right? What does that mean for your programs? If you raise another $200,000, what does that mean in terms of the quantity, the qualitative impact, and the quantitative impact? And model that out, right? For this organization, I did a 10-year model from fiscal year 23 all the way down to fiscal year 2032 and created different percentage brackets on how the organization could grow. And I put some highlight points down here. So it's not to say, hey, for the whole 10 years, we have to grow by 5%. It's an easy and sustainable and very consistent way to look at it. You could say, look, for the next 3 years, we need to grow by 5%. Why? Because we need to get to serving this number of students, and we can't do it unless if by fiscal year 25, we get to $5 million, right? And you can stagger this and say, for the next 3 years, fiscal year 26, 27, 28, then you move on over here and say, we need to increase our budget by 7%, right? And have the rationale for it that relates to your impact. It can't just be because we want to raise more money, right? We want to make sure that whatever we're trying to do on the revenue side is aligned with what needs to be done on the programmatic and impact side, that it's measurable, because we want to be able to have a very strong narrative to share with our donors at the end of the day as to why we came up with this number, why we need their help in funding it, and what impact is going to look like for the return on investment on their dollars, right, that they're giving to us. And then lastly, I spoke about this, it's about building your team and your staff capacity. All right, we want to get to $5 million in 3 years. We're a $2 million organization now. How are we going to get there, right? Renee can't raise all the money by herself, right? Eventually, we're going to have to grow staff. We're going to have to grow the staff in ways, again, that align with programmatic direction and impact. And then we're going to have to measure that impact to go back now and share again with our donors and eventually put in our impact report. So what does that look like? So let's say your staff looks like this year, and I have a 10-year model. I didn't want to overwhelm everybody on the call today, but we have let's say this is the current model here. And then mapping out budget-wise, we have this on a separate sheet, but I left the little number down here, $499,000 is what it would take to fund this development staff. And that's only the base salary. That's not even including the benefits, right? All right, so fiscal year 24, what might that look like? Well, let me go back here. FY23, if I'm an organization that's saying, look, we really need to focus and strategize on corporate engagement, on our corporate donors and foundation donors. Okay, fantastic. So we're going to go down here and say, all right, so for the first year, we only have budget to add a corporate, someone to support our corporate giving stream, right? We may not be able to add foundation yet, but our DEIB strategy is very strong, and we know we can't have a full DEIB strong fundraising program if individual donors are not a part of it. So even though we want to grow foundations, what's more important here? So, you got to balance the scale, right? And figure out what's more important. So in this case, this organization wanted to add a director of individual giving before they added support for foundation, because they want to diversify their donor base and get into some of the grassroots fundraising. Okay. Then in year 3, FY25, they add the foundation's relations manager. And then they also add a special events, thinking, hey, okay, we'll probably be fully out of COVID in terms of people will probably be back to being normal, right? And getting back into events and things like that. So let's add our events person, let's add the foundation. And so the other 7 slides I created for this would have the same thing, right? How much it's going to cost for them to actually fund the department. And it goes on to building out the individual giving. It builds out the operations leg a little bit as well. It gives the VP of development an assistant. And at its latest phase, it gives it's a director of plan giving that comes in. And these positions here get promoted to the VP level. This goes into a chief level. So it just kind of staggers, but having it is great. Following it is even better, but we all know realistically things are going to change, but it gives you a platform on which to pivot. That is all I have. Okay. I know we went a little bit over time, but we still have a few minutes for questions. And here's my email. If you have questions you don't get to ask today, please email me. Feel free to email me. I have no problem with that, or drop your email in the chat since it's only a tiny, tiny group today. The whole world won't have your email. And I'm happy to get back to you too on questions that you might have.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Martinez, for that wonderful presentation. And so we can open the floor to questions, and feel free, since this is a small group, to raise your hand through the Zoom chat if you would like to ask a question. I can go ahead and get us started with questions. I do have one. Can you describe what donors are looking for in an institution and how that can be a part of their reach out and outreach for donors?
Yeah, that's a great question. Very good question, Miranda. So I think it differs by donor, but I would say the one common thread that I've seen and know that every donor, and the research backs it up, that every donor is looking for is that ROI on whatever investment they make, whether it's $50 or $5 million. What was the impact that my dollars had? And as nonprofits, sometimes we get the dollars, right? We fulfill the mission and the impact, but we forget to report back to the donor how much that gift helped make this possible. So really relating impact is the number one factor that creates a renewal in donations, right? And that goes along with stewardship. So make sure when you create that stewardship strategy could be 5 steps, right? Maybe you got to start somewhere. It doesn't have to be 16 steps. But when you create that stewardship strategy, that relating impact is a part of that. And when you go back into the slides, you'll see on that stewardship interaction schedule as well that I had the CEO e-blast that goes out quarterly, or the impact newsletter that goes out twice a year. But make sure you're telling their donors what amazing work their dollars have been doing.
My question is, I'm thinking about having like a reception and what information to share to a predominantly white audience, because I think I told you I'm currently in Maryland, but I really do live in Oxford, North Carolina, and the building I'm working on restoring to make it a community center is in Oxford. Thank you for the presentation. I wrote down a lot of notes and some things that I've been remiss in doing. I need to get some of my other club members to really work on a mailing list and to send thank you notes to donors donated like 5 years ago that I really haven't reached out to again. So, sure. But for reception, and I was just, I've done some slides as to, let's say I've gotten 75% of the money. I showed them where the money's coming from in a slide. If I was to group together, just what would be mostly beneficial if I was inviting even you guys to hear about our project and ask you for money.
Yeah, so I would first ask how big is the group, what capacity you're looking at, because that'll kind of drive how intimate too you kind of want to get with the group. But I would say I would start off with a little bit of history about the organization, but through it all, asking yourself the question, what is it that I'm trying to accomplish here? Are you hoping that by the time you walk out the door that folks are giving money? Are you hoping that they're just more educated about the organization? It sounds like you want to walk out with some dollars.
Yeah.
Or both, right?
Yes.
So I would focus on a little bit of history about the organization, the impact that you've had in the community, the impact you're trying to have, and what you need to make that impact happen. And then lastly, how they can help make that impact happen, which would be your ask or what have you. And if you have a goal for the event too, Rosalind, to be sure, whatever the fundraising goal is, that you share that as well.
Okay.
Yeah, and any videos or images that you might have that are compelling. And again, I always go the route of inviting a stakeholder to these types of events where there's a speaking opportunity. So one gala we had, I invited a mom who was really impacted by our program. Her child attended a piano, this was when I was at my time at the Gantt Center, attended a piano workshop, a jazz workshop, touched a saxophone for the first time and never looked back. And I think he's still playing the saxophone now. And he was only 8. He said, "Mom, that workshop changed my life." So she came into our gala, spoke, cried, because they know we have to speak about it, right? It's part of our work, as connected as we are. But I would try to see if there was a stakeholder even that you could Zoom in if they can't get there in person, to share some of the mission impact, or even if you can't, if it's too late, there's not enough time, get a quote. And I would open up with a quote and say, before I start, I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. I want to open up with a quote or a story if you don't have a quote, but something that'll really tie them in emotionally before you even get into, impact numbers and the ask and things like that.
Okay, that's good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have one more question.
Yes.
What would you say would be the best course of action for donors who do not want to renew and going forward in the future on that?
Yeah, so I always like to find out why, but you're never going to get why from everyone. For nonprofits, the number is staggering. For nonprofits, especially cultural and heritage humanities organizations, particularly those with membership programs, if you have a renewal rate of 45% or higher, that's considered fantastic. And the number is so disheartening, right? So you already know you're going to lose a percentage of donors. But one thing that I've done in the past is send out a survey to donors that we have lost as kind of a blanket cover to say, please share with us, how could we have been better? And for the donors that were given for a while and we just abruptly lost them, but we know they came to the event 2 months ago, or I know I had a phone call, I get together with them. If it's whatever's coming, if it's a phone call, and most of this pre-COVID, of course, right? Phone call, but like have coffee or lunch and find out what's going on. When I worked at the museum, I would invite them to the Gantt Center, to an exhibition, and find out what it is that's going on. And I've heard everything from my mom's having surgery, so I actually had to move her in with me and I'm paying for everything now, to my dad had a heart attack, to, we shifted to the stock market has changed. I mean, there's so many different reasons people stop giving. And so it just really varies, but I would say find out, because whatever you need to course correct, sometimes you won't be able to, it's a personal reason, but there are some things you can course correct. I've had donors say, well, I gave a gift last year. I know you're new, but nobody ever got in touch with me. Nobody said thank you. Nobody, and it's like, well, that's not good. So now we know we need to work on stewardship. So definitely try to ask and find out the reason why. And accept that people are just going to change priorities. At some point, they're just going to change priorities as well. Any other questions? Renee, I saw you busy away typing up notes. So if anything comes up afterwards, feel free to email me as well.
If you wanted to give an incentive, let's say for $1,000, because I'm from a small town and, and they're pretty much retired, what would the type of incentive be?
I think it depends. What is at the forefront of your mission, Rosalind? Like, what is it that you all?
Right now, I guess the forefront is getting enough money to restore, rehab the building. Okay. Have a strategy, okay. And once I get the building, they see something going on and get the building going. Yeah. Like a 4-year process. And I can understand people saying, well, I donated 4 years ago and I don't see any construction. And I have to tell them that, we're doing review compliance stuff, meetings to make sure we have all the ordinances and in place. Yeah. But so I almost think that once they start doing the construction, that maybe I should work more with individuals after the building is pretty much going up. I'm not, I need money now, but I think some people like to show me, Yeah. So a couple things. So one, if you have donors who are in proximity to where the site is being built, or who don't mind driving a half hour or what have you, I would just do sort of a background, almost like a backstage tour with them to say, here is the site. We're hoping to, maybe if there's I don't know if there's a blueprint already for it, to say, we're hoping this will be placed here or placed there, that sort of thing, like an on-site backstage tour, give them that access. I haven't done that. That's good. Thank you. Yeah. And I think, if there's a donor who's far away, or, I'm always thinking about, ADA and just really being accessible to folks. Maybe it's a nice
a historical photo of the site that you send. You print it out at a Kinko's or FedEx or UPS or something, and frame it for them, in a non-expensive frame. Have it signed by someone who is of significance to the site in a way. Maybe it's the person building it, maybe it's you, right? Have them sign it or what have you, and send it to them with a handwritten note saying, hey, we just wanted you to have this historical momentum. Yeah.
So do you think, because we have a couple of senators, representatives who supported the project.
A couple of
senators and representatives in North Carolina. I'm not sure if you know Representative Taylor Garrison from the from the Piedmont area.
I've heard his name, but I don't know him. Yeah. Yeah. Someone
in Butterfield.
Yeah.
That's a neat idea.
Yeah, or something like that. And if you wanted to go digital, Rosalind, I don't know if you have is there a website?
We do have a website. Yeah.
If you wanted to go digital, and one of the things that I'm actually going to be working on for my current nonprofit is a digital donor wall. So you can have a picture, right, of a historical picture of the site, and maybe have a slideshow of the progression of the construction. But then underneath you list the donors at different levels. It looks a little weird when it's only 1 or 2 donors at first, but once you maybe get, 5 or 6 donors going or so, you can start.
So we have quite a bit that gave at the beginning, even though it's like the majority gave like less than 200, but we do have some that gave.
But they still gave, yeah.
Yeah, they did. So that's great. Okay.
Absolutely, and add them to that donor wall.
Okay, great. Okay, I can do that. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe it's like at any level you get on the website, whatever level you give, you give them something. And then maybe it's if you give, I don't know, 1,000 or 500, you get, some sort of a poster. And then if you give above 1,000, whatever levels you want to do, if you give 2,500 or 5,000, you get a backstage tour or, an on-site tour. Okay. And if you give 5 or 10,000, I would say you get invited to the ribbon cutting once the new construction is up.
Oh yeah. Okay.
God forbid if you're still alive.
No, I'm ready for
this. A lot of them are seeing it, bless their heart. Yeah. Okay.
I really am. Thank you. This has been very informational. This is great. And I'll be there. That's the next one, right?
I'm sorry?
That's the next one is August 9th. Something is.
Yes, the next one is August 9th with a panel of 3 participants, I think.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Ms. Martinez, for this presentation. It's been very informative.
Yes.
The next webinar is the final webinar in this series, will be on Tuesday, August 9th. We'll be having a conversation with heritage practitioners in North Carolina. But once again, thank you guys so much for coming in, for sharing your time with us today. If you have